Ladies and gentlemen, in the early, dark days of World War II, when tyranny cast its shadow across Europe, the world witnessed a contest not just of armies and weapons, but of will, imagination, and industry. Among the most infamous voices of Nazi arrogance was Hermann Göring, Hitler's boastful Luftwaffe chief, who upon hearing that the United States planned to build 50,000 airplanes a year, erupted in laughter. He declared that such an idea was absurd, that it was the fantasy of dreamers and amateurs. After all, before the war, America's total annual aircraft production was a mere few thousand planes. To Göring and his Luftwaffe staff, the thought that the Americans, isolated, untested, and slow to mobilize, could suddenly summon such power was laughable. But history has a sharp sense of irony, because while Göring was laughing, America was building. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt announced in 1940 that the United States would produce 50,000 planes per year, many even within his own country doubted it could be done. The number seemed impossible. The entire world's aircraft output didn't come close to that figure. Yet Roosevelt understood something Göring did not, that America's greatest weapon was not a single tank, plane, or ship. It was the limitless capacity of free people united by purpose, ingenuity, and determination. Factories that once made cars, washing machines, and bicycles transformed overnight into roaring aviation plants. Men and women, millions of them, flocked to assembly lines, their hands shaping aluminum, riveting wings, and fitting engines. The hum of production became the heartbeat of a nation at war. From Detroit to Seattle, from Long Beach to Wichita, the arsenal of democracy came alive. The Ford Motor Company built the massive Willow Run plant, where a B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the line every 63 minutes. Boeing's factories stretched for miles, producing the mighty B-17 Flying Fortresses and later the B-29 Superfortresses that would darken the skies over Germany and Japan. Women, Rosie the Riveters, became symbols of an industrial revolution on a wartime scale never before seen. They worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, fueled by coffee, grit, and patriotism. Each bolt tightened, each rivet driven, brought the Allied cause closer to victory, and the numbers began to speak for themselves. By 1944, American factories were producing more than 96,000 aircraft in a single year. Bombers, fighters, transports, and trainers, nearly twice the goal Göring had mocked. The United States didn't just meet Roosevelt's challenge, it shattered it. Let's pause and reflect on what that meant in the context of global war. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Nazi Germany, had entered the war with a sense of invincibility. They had swept through Poland, crushed France, and battled Britain in the skies over the English Channel. But by 1943, that confidence was crumbling. The tide had turned. While German factories were bombed, stripped of resources, and dependent on forced labor, American industry surged forward, untouched, unstoppable, and overflowing with resources. Every B-17 that took off from an English airfield, every P-51 Mustang that escorted bombers deep into German territory, every C-47 that dropped paratroopers on D-Day, was part of that miracle of production. America didn't just build planes, it built the backbone of the Allied air war. By war's end, the United States had produced more than 300,000 aircraft. Think about that, 300,000 planes in less than 5 years. Göring's laughter had turned into despair. His Luftwaffe, once feared, was being swept from the skies by a relentless storm of American-made steel and fire. But the miracle of American production wasn't just about numbers. It was about belief. It was about a nation that refused to be intimidated, that believed in its workers, its engineers, and its dreamers. It was about people who looked at impossible goals and said, "We can do this." That confidence came from the heart of democracy itself. In Nazi Germany, production was driven by fear and obedience. In America, it was driven by choice and conviction. The workers didn't build planes because they were ordered to. They built them because they wanted to. Because they believed in freedom, in their families, and in a world worth fighting for. That's what Göring could never understand. He could measure steel but not spirit. He could count planes but not people's resolve. Consider this, the US didn't just outproduce its enemies, it out-innovated them. American engineers refined designs, improved engines, and developed technologies that set new standards for aviation. From the long-range Mustang that turned the air war in Europe, to the B-29 that brought the Pacific conflict to a close, every innovation reflected an unyielding drive to do better, faster, stronger. Meanwhile, Göring watched helplessly as his Luftwaffe faltered. His pilots were overworked, his fuel supplies dwindled, and his factories crumbled under the weight of Allied bombing. By 1944, the Luftwaffe that had once dominated Europe was on its knees. The American planes he had mocked now roamed freely over Germany, turning the laughter of arrogance into the silence of defeat. There's a profound lesson in that transformation. It reminds us that ridicule is often the first response of the fearful. Göring's laughter was not confidence, it was denial. He laughed because he could not imagine a free nation capable of such unity. But America's response was simple and silent: build. Build until the laughter dies, and it did. The war ended not because one man laughed, but because millions of men and women refused to quit. In hangars and factories, in design rooms and airfields, the United States proved that freedom and determination can forge miracles from metal. When Hermann Göring stood in the ruins of Berlin in 1945, facing the collapse of everything he had built his pride upon, he must have remembered those words, the boastful laughter, the disbelief. Somewhere in that silence, amid the rubble, Perhaps he finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. Because while tyranny feeds on fear, democracy feeds on faith, faith in people, in possibility, and in the future. The story of America's 100 Zaluden planes is not just a story of industry, it is a story of spirit. It's a reminder that when a free people decide to rise to a challenge, there is no force on earth that can stop them. So yes, Hermann Göring laughed. But history did not laugh with him. Instead, it watched as America's assembly lines turned mockery into might and doubt into destiny. And when those engines roared to life, and the sky filled with the thunder of American aircraft, the world saw the truth, that the laughter of arrogance will always be silenced by the courage of the free. Thank you. When history remembers the arrogance of the Axis powers, few figures embody that pride and blindness more completely than Hermann Göring, the pompous, preening commander of Hitler's Luftwaffe. He wore his medals like trophies from another age, strutted through marble halls in ornate uniforms, and spoke as if the entire sky belonged to him. In his mind, the Luftwaffe was the supreme instrument of war, an invincible air armada that had crushed Poland, shattered France, and rained destruction on London. When he looked across the Atlantic at America, still distant from the war in 1940, Göring saw a land of consumers, dreamers, and businessmen, not warriors, not builders of war machines. So when he heard that President Franklin D. Roosevelt had pledged to produce 50,000 aircraft a year, Göring laughed. He did not chuckle politely. He laughed with the arrogance of a man who believed he ruled the skies, certain that no other nation could match German engineering, German industry, or German will. To Göring and the high command of the Luftwaffe, the United States was a sleeping giant whose industrial talk was nothing more than propaganda. Before the war, America's aircraft output had barely reached 6,000 planes a year. Göring's factories, already turning out Messerschmitts and Junkers bombers by the thousands, seemed years ahead. He saw Roosevelt's goal not as ambition but as absurdity. He told his officers that the Americans were children playing with toys, incapable of mobilizing their soft, capitalist society into a war machine. He had grown up in a Germany where militarism was culture, where precision engineering was a national art. To his mind, democracy was a weakness, not a strength. And when a democratic leader spoke of miracles of production, Göring heard only wishful thinking. But what Göring failed to understand was that America's strength lay not in loud boasts or rigid control, but in its quiet, patient power, its boundless resources, its restless creativity, and its belief that anything was possible when free people worked toward a common purpose. Göring's arrogance was rooted in ignorance. He judged the world through the narrow lens of dictatorship, where production came from fear and obedience, not innovation and cooperation. He did not know what it meant for a nation to build not because it was ordered to, but because it chose to. That difference, between compulsion and conviction, would prove decisive. In Berlin, Göring's laughter echoed through the marble halls of the Air Ministry. He dismissed Roosevelt's declaration as American bluff. His aides joined in, smirking at the idea that the same country which made chewing gum, movies, and motorcars could ever threaten the mighty Luftwaffe. He had seen photographs of American airfields, small, scattered, filled with biplanes and trainers. He compared them to the sleek squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s lined up on German runways, and he saw only weakness. America, he believed, could never mobilize its industry fast enough. It lacked the discipline, the efficiency, and the will. But in his laughter, Göring revealed something deeper, fear disguised as ridicule. His confidence was not unshakable, it was brittle. Beneath the pride, there was an awareness that Germany's success depended on speed. Hitler's blitzkrieg victories had come from striking before others could prepare. Time was Germany's greatest enemy, and Göring's arrogance was, in part, a denial of that truth. The longer the war lasted, the more the world's greatest industrial power, the United States, would awaken. Roosevelt understood that reality far better than Göring did. When he spoke of 50,000 planes, he was not describing the present, he was forecasting a future built by belief. He knew that the American spirit, once stirred, could move mountains of steel, but Göring could not see that. He had never lived in a land of freedom and opportunity. He ruled by command, not by cooperation. He could not imagine a country where ordinary workers, women, and engineers could outproduce the state-driven machinery of the Reich. So Göring continued to mock. He gave speeches filled with pompous declarations that the Luftwaffe would crush any American attempt to intervene. He told his men that by the time the United States entered the war, there would be nothing left to save. He believed that the German way, centralized, authoritarian, brutally efficient, was unchallengeable. His arrogance blinded him to the power of innovation and scale that existed in the United States. Meanwhile, across the ocean, while Göring laughed, the wheels of American industry began to turn. Car factories, shipyards, and machine plants transformed almost overnight into producers of wings and engines. Roosevelt's words, which Göring mocked, became blueprints for one of the greatest industrial mobilizations in history. Men and women who had never touched an airplane learned to assemble them. Engineers worked around the clock designing faster, lighter, deadlier machines. The laughter in Berlin was drowned out by the roar of machinery in Detroit, Seattle, and Long Beach. But Göring could not comprehend what was happening. His worldview did not allow him to. He measured power in divisions and squadrons, in medals and hierarchy, not in ideas, morale, and willpower. He never believed that civilian America, that land of jazz, newspapers, and assembly lines could become a nation of warriors. Even when reports reached Berlin that new factories were opening by the dozen, Goering dismissed them as propaganda. He had built his empire on illusion, and he could not afford to see reality until it was too late. There was a tragic irony in Goering's arrogance. He had once been a great pilot, a hero of the First World War, but power had corrupted his judgment. The man who had once understood the sky now saw only through the lens of ego. He had surrounded himself with flatterers and, yes, men who told him what he wanted to hear. When Germany bombed London in 1940, Goering had promised Hitler that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. When American and British bombers began pounding German cities in 1943, that promise lay in ashes. The man who once laughed at Roosevelt's dream now hid in bunkers as Allied planes, tens of thousands of them, darkened the skies he once claimed to own. And yet, at the time of Roosevelt's announcement, Goering's laughter reflected a wider German arrogance. The Nazi leadership believed their enemies were too soft, too divided, too slow. They believed in the myth of their own superiority, racial, industrial, and military. That arrogance blinded them to the truth that democracy, when threatened, can become the most formidable force on earth. For all their rigid discipline and propaganda, the Nazis could not compete with the creative chaos of American capitalism harnessed for war. Goering saw American advertisements and Hollywood films as symbols of weakness. He never realized they were also symbols of imagination, innovation, and the ability to inspire millions. As the war dragged on, Goering's underestimation became his undoing. While he was boasting in Berlin, American production was rewriting the very definition of possibility. The United States didn't just meet the goal of 50,000 planes, it surpassed it, producing nearly 100,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. Goering's Luftwaffe, once dominant, was slowly suffocated under an avalanche of American bombers and fighters. German factories were bombed day and night, railways shattered, fuel supplies destroyed. The Luftwaffe pilots, outnumbered and outgunned, fought bravely but hopelessly. They were swallowed by the sheer scale of American production, the very scale Goering had once mocked. The laughter stopped. Reports flooded Goering's headquarters describing the devastation. Fleets of flying fortresses bombing by day, Lancaster squadrons by night, waves of Mustangs escorting them deep into the Reich. The skies he had once promised to defend were filled with the thunder of American engines. His pilots could barely take off before they were hunted down. His factories were crippled, his fuel gone, his dreams shattered. Every bomber that roared overhead was a monument to his failure of imagination. And yet, even in defeat, Goering never fully understood his mistake. He blamed his subordinates, his pilots, even Hitler himself, but he never admitted that he had underestimated the spirit of a free nation. That was the tragedy of tyranny. It could never see beyond its own reflection. To Goering, people were tools, not partners. To America, people were power. That was the difference. That was why the laughter of arrogance was drowned out by the engines of liberty. There is a moment described by Allied intelligence officers after Goering's capture in 1945. Sitting in his cell, stripped of his medals, bloated and broken, he was shown photographs of American airfields. Endless rows of bombers, fighters, and transports stretching as far as the eye could see. The same airfields that had made his boasts into jokes. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, with a faint, bitter smile, he muttered that had he known America could build like that, he might have thought differently. It was not an apology, it was a confession of disbelief. Goering had never believed that such strength could come from freedom. His laughter, which had once filled marble halls, now echoed only in the hollow silence of defeat. The arrogance that had mocked Roosevelt's vision became the symbol of Nazi blindness. He had measured America by the wrong scale, judging it by what it was, not what it could become. That is the fatal mistake of all tyrants. They see only the surface, never the soul. Goering saw a land of comfort and underestimated its courage. He saw factories and missed the faith that powered them. He saw civilians and forgot they were citizens of a nation that, when roused, could build more, fight harder, and endure longer than any dictatorship ever could. And so, the laughter that began in arrogance ended in ruin. Hermann Goering's name, once spoken with fear, became a cautionary tale, a reminder that pride without understanding is the prelude to downfall. His disbelief in America's power was not just a personal misjudgment. It was a reflection of an entire regime's failure to grasp what democracy truly means. When Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before the American people in 1940 and declared that the United States must produce 50,000 planes a year, his words fell like thunder across a nation still half asleep to the realities of global war. It was a statement that shocked the world, not because of its poetry but because of its audacity. To many, it sounded impossible. America was still emerging from the Great Depression, still neutral in the conflict raging across Europe, still uncertain of its place in a world consumed by chaos. Yet Roosevelt looked beyond the numbers, beyond the doubts, and beyond the fear. He understood something fundamental, that in the coming struggle, victory would not belong to those with the loudest speeches or the biggest armies, but to those who could turn imagination into action, and action into power. When he announced the goal of producing 50,000 planes a year, Roosevelt wasn't merely speaking of machines, he was summoning a nation to believe in itself again. He was igniting a transformation of industry, of spirit, and of purpose. At that time, the United States was building fewer than 6,000 aircraft annually. The goal he set represented not an increase but a revolution, a tenfold leap into the unknown. Engineers and businessmen alike whispered that it couldn't be done. Congress murmured that the cost would be astronomical. The military doubted that so many planes could even be used. But Roosevelt's genius was that he didn't measure possibility by present capacity, he measured it by potential. He saw not the limitations of a country recovering from depression, but the limitless energy of a people untested by crisis. He had watched the world descend into flames, Germany overrunning Poland and France, Britain standing alone beneath the bombs of the Luftwaffe. Roosevelt knew that America's destiny could no longer be isolation. He understood that this was not just Europe's war, it was a challenge to the very idea of freedom. But how could a nation that had not yet mobilized, that still cherished its peace, meet that challenge? Roosevelt's answer was clear: through production, through preparation, through belief. We must be the great arsenal of democracy, he declared, and with that phrase, he began the greatest industrial mobilization in human history. It's easy today to look back at that promise and see only the outcome, the hundreds of thousands of planes that filled the skies, the bombers and fighters that carried victory across 2 oceans. But in that moment in 1940, it was a dream balanced on the edge of doubt. The factories were not yet built. The workforce was not yet trained. The blueprints for many of the aircraft had not even been drawn. The idea of producing 50,000 planes a year was like asking a mountain to move. And yet Roosevelt's confidence gave that mountain a reason to shift. He understood leadership not as the art of prediction, but as the art of creation, of making others believe in what they had not yet seen. He called upon the automobile industry, upon engineers, upon ordinary men and women to lend their hands to a national purpose. He knew that America's greatest strength was not its army or navy, but its ingenuity and unity when challenged. And so he began to fuse the machinery of democracy into the machinery of war. Under Roosevelt's direction, the War Department and private industry entered a partnership unlike any in history. Automakers like Ford and General Motors, aircraft pioneers like Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed were summoned not as competitors but as comrades in arms. Roosevelt told them plainly that the defense of freedom would be built not in speeches, but in assembly lines. And they answered that call. Ford Motor Company began planning what would become the massive Willow Run plant in Michigan, an industrial cathedral so vast that workers joked it had its own weather. At its peak, a completed B-24 bomber rolled off its line every hour. Boeing expanded production in Seattle and Wichita, producing the B-17 Flying Fortress at a pace that stunned even military planners. Douglas Aircraft converted car plants into aircraft factories. Everywhere, the hum of machinery became the pulse of a nation preparing for war. Roosevelt's challenge did more than build planes. It built confidence. For the first time since the Great Depression, Americans felt a sense of collective pride in their ability to shape destiny. Men and women who had once stood in unemployment lines now stood shoulder to shoulder on factory floors, their hands forging wings of aluminum and engines of power. His words transformed despair into determination. People who had doubted the future found purpose in the present. The war was not yet America's to fight, but it was already America's to prepare for. And Roosevelt, with his calm voice and unshakable optimism, became the conductor of that vast national orchestra. He spoke to the people not in the language of fear, but of faith. He told them that democracy's greatest weapon was its belief in human potential. Where dictators ruled through command and terror, Roosevelt ruled through persuasion and trust. He understood that when people are free, when they are inspired rather than intimidated, they can do the impossible. The production goal was not just a number, it was a moral declaration. It told the world that America would not cower behind its oceans while tyranny marched. It told Hitler, Goering, and all their cohorts that the age of dictators would meet its match in the factories and fields of a free republic. It was a message to allies and enemies alike that America would not stand idly by while the world burned. Even before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's challenge had begun reshaping the nation. New industries emerged overnight. Men learned trades they had never known. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, not as an act of necessity alone, but of patriotism. The figure of Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of this transformation, a living testament to Roosevelt's belief that the American people, when united, could outbuild, outthink, and outlast any adversary. As production surged, Roosevelt's faith began to bear fruit. By 1942, American aircraft output had already surpassed Germany's. By 1943, it doubled. By 1944, it reached a height no one had dared to predict, over 96,000 aircraft in a single year. Roosevelt's words, once doubted, had become reality. What Goering had laughed at became the instrument of his own downfall. The skies over Europe and the Pacific were filled with the sound of American engineers. A chorus born from one man's belief that a democracy, when mobilized, could defeat despotism through the sheer force of will and production. The scope of Roosevelt's vision cannot be overstated. He did not merely demand planes, he demanded a new way of thinking. He called on American engineers to innovate, to simplify, to make production faster and more efficient. The concept of mass production, perfected in the automobile industry, was now applied to aircraft, ships, and munitions. Assembly lines that had once built cars now rolled out fighters and bombers with precision and speed. The government established the War Production Board to coordinate resources, ensuring that steel, aluminum, and rubber flowed where they were needed most. Roosevelt saw to it that every part of the nation became part of the mission. The North built engines, the South provided raw materials, the Midwest became the heart of manufacturing, and the West Coast turned into an airfield stretching from Seattle to San Diego. But beyond the logistics, Roosevelt's genius lay in understanding the psychological dimension of war. He knew that numbers alone would not win. The people had to believe that what they were doing mattered. He spoke to them through his fireside chats, turning national policy into personal conversation. He told mothers that their sons would fly planes built by their own hands. He told workers that every rivet driven was a blow for freedom. He connected the home front to the front lines in a way no leader before him had ever done. Roosevelt also knew that the war to come would be fought not only with weapons, but with ideas. He saw the contrast between democracy and tyranny as a moral contest. The dictators of Europe believed that only authoritarian states could mobilize efficiently. Roosevelt proved them wrong. He demonstrated that the freedom to think, to speak, to innovate was not a hindrance, it was an advantage. American factories did not need whips or threats, they ran on pride, ingenuity, and competition. Workers did not fear their supervisors, they took pride in surpassing them. Engineers did not wait for permission, they created solutions. That spirit, the spirit Roosevelt trusted, was the true arsenal of democracy. When Zhu Ring heard Roosevelt's 50,000 plane challenge, he laughed because he thought no free people could achieve it. But Roosevelt was not speaking to the likes of Zhu Ring. He was speaking to the millions of men and women who would soon turn their sweat into steel. His words traveled through the towns and cities of America, echoing in factories, classrooms, and shipyards. They reached farmers who sold their crops for war bonds, teenagers who took jobs after school, and soldiers who would one day fly the very planes their families had built. There was a kind of poetry in Roosevelt's leadership, quiet yet unbreakable, visionary yet grounded in reality. He understood the machinery of government, but he also understood the machinery of the human heart. He did not demand miracles, he inspired them. By the time America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the industrial base he had envisioned was already in motion. The assembly lines were running, the workers were trained, the factories were humming. When war came, America did not stumble, it surged. Roosevelt's challenge to build 50,000 planes a year had prepared the United States not only for war, but for leadership in the modern world. It transformed a weary, recovering nation into a superpower of production and innovation. It united farmers and factory workers, men and women, scientists and laborers under one purpose. And it sent a message across the world that democracy, when tested, would not falter. It would rise, it would build, and it would prevail. When Franklin Roosevelt declared that the United States must become the arsenal of democracy, his words did more than echo across radio waves. They became the heartbeat of a nation awakening to its destiny. For years, America had stood at the edge of the global conflict, watching as Europe burned under the weight of tyranny. But now, the time for watching was over. The time for building had begun. Across the land, the hum of machinery replaced the silence of hesitation. The whistle of factories, the pounding of hammers, and the steady rhythm of assembly lines became the new music of freedom. The arsenal of democracy had come to life, and it was a sound the world would never forget. In the beginning there was uncertainty. The United States was still a nation at peace, reluctant to be drawn into another world war. Memories of the Great War's losses were still fresh, and isolationist sentiment ran deep. Yet Roosevelt's call awakened something ancient and powerful. The belief that freedom, once threatened, must be defended not just by words but by work. He told the American people that their factories would be the front lines until their soldiers could march. He told them that the weapons of liberty would be forged not by generals, but by workers. That challenge stirred the country's imagination. It turned small towns into production hubs and ordinary citizens into soldiers of steel and labor. At first, it seemed impossible. The United States in 1939 was still emerging from the Great Depression. Unemployment had only recently begun to fall. Many factories were idle or outdated. The industrial giants, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, had spent decades making cars, not bombers. Shipyards were old and airplane manufacturing was still a young industry. The scale of Roosevelt's ambition defied logic. Yet beneath that surface of uncertainty lay something unmatched: the creative fire of the American spirit. Almost overnight, the transformation began. Ford Motor Company, led by the legendary Henry Ford, turned from making automobiles to producing aircraft. The Willow Run plant in Michigan became a marvel of modern engineering, a factory so massive that it stretched a mile in length and employed tens of thousands. On those endless assembly lines, men and women worked side by side, riveting wings, installing engines, and painting insignias of stars and bars. At the height of its production, a new B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the line every 63 minutes, a pace so astonishing that it seemed almost impossible to believe. The industrial might of democracy was awakening. General Motors joined the effort, converting its auto plants to produce engines, propellers, and parts for fighters and bombers. The Douglas Aircraft Company expanded its production of C-47 transport planes, the very aircraft that would one day drop paratroopers over Normandy on D-Day. Boeing built vast new plants to produce the B-17 Flying Fortress, and Later, the B-29 Superfortress, which would deliver the final blows against Japan. Across the nation, new factories rose from fields and forests, their windows glowing through the night as Americans worked around the clock. The hum of progress became the rhythm of survival. Everywhere, industries learned to speak a new language, the language of war production. Steel mills poured out rivers of molten metal. Aluminum plants multiplied output tenfold to feed the hunger of aircraft construction. Rubber, copper, and fuel were rationed and redirected toward the war effort. Shipyards that had once launched merchant vessels now churned out destroyers, aircraft carriers, and Liberty ships at a rate that stunned even seasoned admirals. The arsenal of democracy was not one place, it was every place. From the bustling ports of California to the steel towns of Pennsylvania, from the cornfields of Iowa to the oil fields of Texas, every corner of the nation became a cog in the colossal machine of freedom. And yet, the miracle was not only in the machines but in the people. Millions of workers, men and women, young and old, skilled and unskilled, flocked to the factories. The Great Depression had left many without work or hope, but now the war effort gave them purpose. They wore overalls instead of uniforms, carried wrenches instead of rifles, but they were no less vital to victory. Among them were women who had never before worked outside their homes, now stepping into roles left vacant by men who had gone to fight. They became the face of America's awakening, the Rosies, with bandanas tied around their hair, the welders and riveters who turned factories into fortresses. Each rivet they drove, each bolt they tightened, was a declaration that tyranny would not prevail. The scale of production was beyond anything the world had seen. By 1942, American factories were producing more planes, tanks, and ships than all the Axis powers combined. Every week, new assembly lines opened. Every month, new records were broken. The sheer speed of transformation was staggering. A nation that had once measured productivity in cars per day was now measuring it in bombers per hour. It wasn't just about numbers, it was about faith. Every plane built, every ship launched, was proof that Roosevelt's promise was real. The arsenal of democracy was not merely a slogan, it was a movement. It united business leaders, labor unions, engineers, and politicians under one goal: to produce victory. The government established the War Production Board to coordinate this vast network of factories and suppliers. It wasn't easy. There were shortages, strikes, and logistical nightmares, but Roosevelt's steady hand kept the machine moving. He inspired through confidence, and his confidence inspired others to act. The once fragmented industries of America now worked in harmony, each part of a vast symphony of production. It is difficult to imagine today what it looked like, the sight of America in full industrial motion. Trainloads of aircraft parts rumbling across the country, ships leaving the shipyard so frequently that workers barely paused to celebrate each launch, highways crowded with convoys of trucks carrying munitions, engines, and uniforms. At night, cities glowed with the fires of forges and furnaces. The war effort did not sleep. It pulsed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That constant movement was more than economic, it was emotional. It gave Americans a sense of unity unlike anything before. A farmer in Kansas could look at the sky and know that his steel ration had helped build the wings of a bomber. A mother in Detroit could open a newspaper and read about soldiers fighting with rifles produced in her factory. Every person, every town, every shift became a small but indispensable part of a grand purpose. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just building weapons, it was building belief. The belief that freedom was worth every ounce of labor and sacrifice. The sheer diversity of American production was astounding. Factories didn't just make planes and tanks. They made the spare parts, the ammunition, the uniforms, the boots, the radios, the food containers, and the medical kits. Even toy manufacturers began making compasses and parts for military instruments. Typewriter companies turned their precision machines toward producing machine gun components. Sewing machine factories stitched parachutes. The entire nation became a single coordinated organism, its heartbeat synchronized with the rhythm of war. The result was overwhelming. By 1944, the United States was producing nearly 100,000 aircraft a year, along with tens of thousands of tanks, millions of rifles, and fleets of ships that filled the oceans. It was a scale so immense that even allies like Britain and the Soviet Union depended on American production to survive. Convoys crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific carrying the fruits of America's labor. Planes, trucks, food, and weapons, to every front line. The arsenal of democracy did not merely arm the United States, it armed the free world. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this transformation was its speed. In less than 4 years, America had turned from a nation of consumers into a nation of producers. From a society still recovering from economic depression into the greatest manufacturing force in history. No empire, no dictatorship, no regime had ever achieved such a feat. The efficiency of German industry, once the envy of the world, now paled beside the scale and speed of American production. What had begun as a dream in Roosevelt's mind had become a living, roaring, unstoppable reality. The arsenal of democracy was also a triumph of innovation. Engineers rethought everything, from materials to design to logistics. Aircraft designs were simplified to make mass production faster. New techniques like welding replaced slower methods of riveting in shipbuilding. Conveyor belts and automated systems revolutionized how war materials were made. Every obstacle became an opportunity for invention. That was the true genius of democracy. It allowed creativity to flourish. In a dictatorship, mistakes were punished. In America, they became lessons that led to breakthroughs. Roosevelt often said that America's power lay not only in its factories but in its freedom, the freedom to think, to adapt, to improve. That freedom was the invisible fuel that powered the arsenal of democracy. It was why American workers felt pride in what they built, why engineers stayed awake through the night solving problems, and why managers pushed for more efficient methods. The drive came not from fear of punishment, but from the passion to win. As the war raged on, the arsenal of democracy became the symbol of American strength. Pilots flying over Europe could look down and know that behind them stood a nation whose labor filled the skies with machines of liberty. Soldiers in North Africa, sailors in the Pacific, paratroopers in France, all were armed, fed, and supplied by the relentless work of millions at home. Every crate stamped, "Made in the USA," carried not just equipment, it carried hope, and across the world people took notice. Allies marveled at the scale of production. Enemies trembled at its implications. G. Ring, who had once laughed at Roosevelt's ambition, now watched in disbelief as the very sky filled with American planes. His laughter had been drowned by the roar of 100,000 engines. The arsenal of democracy had done what no one thought possible. It had transformed mockery into might, and industry into victory. What Roosevelt had envisioned was more than a military strategy, it was a moral awakening. It reminded the world that free nations, when united, could outbuild, outfight, and outlast any tyranny. It proved that democracy was not fragile, it was fierce. And though the war would still demand immense sacrifice, the arsenal of democracy had already ensured one truth, that the factories of freedom could build not only weapons of war, but the foundation of peace. When the United States decided to enter the war, it wasn't just an army that mobilized. It was an entire nation. The story of American mobilization is not simply one of soldiers and generals. It is the story of farmers, factory workers, engineers, and families who turned their ordinary lives into extraordinary acts of production and unity. It was the greatest industrial mobilization the world had ever witnessed, a transformation so vast that it reshaped not only the course of the war, but the destiny of the modern world. In 1940, the United States was still at peace, watching the storm rage across Europe and Asia. Many believed the oceans would protect them. But Roosevelt and his advisors knew better. They knew that sooner or later, America would be drawn into the conflict. The question was not if, but when. And so began a quiet revolution, the preparation for total industrial mobilization. The government began coordinating with private industries, encouraging them to prepare for defense production even before the first American shot was fired. That foresight would soon become the difference between defeat and victory. The challenge was immense. The American economy was only beginning to recover from the Great Depression. Factories were idle and millions were still unemployed. Yet within a few years, those same idle factories would be producing tanks, planes, ships, guns, and ammunition at a rate that defied belief. The transformation required imagination, organization, and leadership on a scale never before attempted. It was not just a change in industry, it was a change in mindset. America had to think as one, act as one, and produce as one. The first great act of mobilization came with the creation of the War Production Board in 1942. This agency became the nerve center of American industry during the war. It coordinated resources, set priorities, allocated materials, and converted civilian production to military output. Automakers who had once prided themselves on sleek car designs now retooled their assembly lines for tanks and bombers. Textile mills stopped making fashion fabrics and started weaving uniforms and parachutes. Typewriter companies produced machine gun parts. Even ice cream freezer manufacturers were redirected to produce ammunition boxes. No resource, no factory, and no worker was left untouched by the call to arms. The numbers tell the story of this transformation. In 1939, the United States produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. By 1944, that number had soared to nearly 100,000 per year. The automotive industry, once the pride of consumer America, produced more than 86,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, and tens of thousands of armored vehicles. Shipyards turned out new vessels so quickly that seasoned sailors could scarcely keep up with the pace of launching them. One of the most stunning achievements was the Liberty Ship program, a fleet of cargo vessels built to carry supplies across the Atlantic. Each Liberty ship could be assembled in weeks, and by war's end, over 700 had been built. That speed of production was unheard of, and it symbolized the efficiency of America's new industrial war machine. But this was not only a story of factories, it was a story of people. Millions of men went off to fight overseas, and millions more were needed to fill their places in the factories. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, breaking barriers and reshaping social norms. They worked as welders, machinists, electricians, and assembly line operators. Their presence on the production lines was not a side story, it was the heart of the industrial effort. The image of Rosie the Rifter became a national icon, symbolizing not only strength and patriotism, but the power of American womanhood. These women proved that victory could be built as well as fought. Alongside them worked African American laborers, immigrants, and rural workers who had never before seen a factory floor. Many had migrated from the South or from distant farms in search of work. They faced discrimination and hardship, but they also found purpose and pride in their labor. The war effort opened new opportunities and began to challenge old inequalities. Industrial mobilization, in its own way, became a force for social change as well as military strength. It united Americans under a common cause, the defense of freedom, and reminded them that democracy meant participation for all. Coordination between government and industry became the foundation of success. Business leaders, many of whom had once resisted federal intervention, now collaborated with Washington to achieve shared goals. Corporations like Ford, General Motors, Boeing, and DuPont became engines of national defense. They competed not for profit but for production speed. Henry J. Kaiser, the industrialist behind the Liberty ships, revolutionized shipbuilding with mass production techniques that mirrored the automobile industry. His shipyards ran day and night, and his workers, many of them new to the trade, built ships faster than anyone thought possible. Kaiser's shipyards weren't alone. Across the nation, industrial centers sprang to life. In Detroit, the arsenal of democracy churned out tanks and bombers. In Seattle, Boeing's vast plants filled the skies with B-17s and B-29s. In Pittsburgh, steel mills roared, pouring out the metal that became the skeleton of the war machine. In Los Angeles, aircraft factories covered miles of land, turning farmland into runways of industry. The rhythm of work became the heartbeat of America. The clanging of steel, the hiss of welding torches, the hum of engines. These were the sounds of democracy in motion. To sustain this level of production, the government had to solve enormous logistical challenges. Raw materials such as steel, aluminum, rubber, and oil had to be carefully rationed and distributed. The War Production Board issued strict quotas to prevent shortages. Civilian goods became scarce, automobiles, tires, even certain food items, but the public accepted these sacrifices with a sense of duty. Citizens planted victory gardens, collected scrap metal, and bought war bonds to fund the effort. Every household became part of the national mobilization. Every act of saving, recycling, or contributing was a step toward victory. The coordination extended to transportation and logistics as well. Railways, shipping lines, and trucking companies were reorganized to move materials efficiently. Fuel and rubber were prioritized for military use, leading to carpooling and fuel rationing at home. The Office of Defense Transportation managed the massive flow of goods from factory to port to battlefield. This logistical web was so vast and efficient that historians still marvel at how seamlessly it operated. The United States not only produced weapons, it delivered them across oceans and continents with astonishing reliability. Innovation played a central role in this mobilization. Engineers and scientists collaborated to improve manufacturing techniques, design new weapons, and develop synthetic materials. When natural rubber from Asia became unavailable due to Japanese occupation, American chemists developed synthetic rubber, saving the tire industry and ensuring the mobility of Allied forces. Aluminum production was expanded with the help of massive hydroelectric projects like the Bonneville and Grand Coulee dams. Every challenge became an opportunity for invention. The nation's ability to adapt and innovate was a direct reflection of its freedom and ingenuity. The industrial mobilization also reshaped the American landscape. Entire new towns were built near factories and shipyards to house workers. Population centers shifted as millions moved to areas with defense contracts. The West Coast, once sparsely industrialized, became a powerhouse of aviation and shipbuilding. Southern states, long dependent on agriculture, began to host munitions plants and military bases. America's geography was being rewritten by the hand of war, and the effects would last for generations. What made this mobilization truly extraordinary was its unity of purpose. Despite differences in background, politics, and class, Americans worked toward a single goal. There were strikes and disputes, of course. No effort of this scale was without tension, but even labor unions pledged not to disrupt production. The urgency of the moment overrode individual grievances. When Roosevelt asked for the cooperation of every man and woman in the production of supplies, the response was overwhelming. Across the nation, communities organized blood drives, bond rallies, and volunteer efforts. Schools taught children how to collect scrap metal. Churches prayed for victory and peace. Every town became a miniature command post in the war of production. The result of this unity was staggering. By 1945, American industry had produced more than 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, 400,000 artillery pieces, and millions of rifles. It had supplied not only its own armed forces but also those of its allies through programs like Lend-Lease. Britain received planes and trucks. The Soviet Union received tanks and locomotives. China received food, fuel, and medical supplies. American factories became the beating heart of the Allied war effort, sending lifeblood across the world to sustain freedom's fight. This mobilization wasn't achieved by coercion or fear, as in totalitarian regimes, but by belief in a cause greater than oneself. It was a triumph of voluntary effort, of collective will guided by democratic leadership. Roosevelt had once said that the strength of democracy lay in its people's ability to act together when it mattered most. The industrial mobilization of World War II proved him right. It showed that when free men and women unite for a common purpose, their combined power can shake the earth. The spirit of that mobilization lived in every factory worker who stayed on the line through the night, in every manager who found a faster way to assemble a bomber, in every family who gave up comforts for the sake of victory. It lived in the determination to outbuild tyranny, to prove that democracy could do more than speak. It could produce, it could fight, and it could win. The German war machine had been built over years of militarization and conquest, but America's was built on the fly, out of farms, workshops, and dreams. Hermann Göring had laughed at the idea of 50,000 planes. He had mocked the notion that a nation of consumers could become a nation of warriors. But he hadn't understood what America truly was. He hadn't seen the spirit that lived in its factories, the discipline of its workers, the unity of its people. When America mobilized, it did not just build machines, it built a force of will so immense that it rolled across oceans, thundered across skies, and changed history forever. When Hermann Göring, the flamboyant head of the German Luftwaffe, heard that the United States intended to build 50,000 airplanes, he laughed. He laughed with the arrogance of a man who believed his nation had already mastered the skies, a man intoxicated by the myth of German industrial and military superiority. To Göring, America was a land of jazz, consumerism, and comfort, soft people with soft hands, too busy making cars and toasters to build warplanes. The idea that the United States, with no standing army to speak of and no modern air force in sight, could produce such an astronomical number of aircraft seemed absurd. He dismissed it as propaganda, the fantasy of politicians who did not understand the demands of total war. But his laughter would not last. In 1939, the Luftwaffe was a terrifying machine. It had been honed through years of secret rearmament, tested in the skies of Spain during the Civil War, and unleashed in devastating fashion over Poland, France, and Britain. German air power was not just a tool of war, it was a symbol of Nazi dominance. Göring strutted in his ornate uniforms, dripping with medals, confident that his air force was unmatched. He believed the Luftwaffe could crush any enemy from the sky before they even had time to mobilize. And for a time, he was right. The world had never seen anything like the Blitzkrieg, a lightning war powered by tanks and aircraft moving in perfect synchronization. Nations fell in weeks. Cities burned in days. Göring's Luftwaffe seemed untouchable, but arrogance is the seed of downfall. Göring's fatal miscalculation was that he underestimated not just American industry, but American resolve. When Roosevelt announced that the United States would build 50,000 planes, it was not bluster, it was a vow. Roosevelt understood something Göring did not, that America's greatest strength lay not in its military tradition, but in its capacity to adapt, to produce, and to believe. Göring laughed because he measured power in terms of what he could already see. Existing squadrons, current factories, the present moment. Roosevelt was looking at what could be built, what could be imagined, and what could be achieved when a free people united under a single purpose. At first, Göring's confidence seemed justified. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, its military was small and underprepared. The U.S. Army Air Corps had fewer than 3,000 modern planes, many outdated by European standards. Pilots were still training in biplanes, and aircraft production was scattered across a handful of modest factories. To the German high command, this was no threat. They saw America as an industrial giant, yes, but a military child. Göring's Luftwaffe, meanwhile, fielded thousands of fighters and bombers, manned by experienced pilots who had already dominated Europe's skies. He believed that by the time America could even field a respectable force, the war would be long over. He was wrong on every count. The moment America entered the war, the floodgates of production opened with a force that stunned the world. Factories that had once produced cars and refrigerators now roared to life, building engines, fuselages, and wings. The skies over Michigan, California, and Texas filled with the thunder of new machines. Airfields expanded overnight. Training programs multiplied. The government poured billions into aviation research and production. The 50,000 planes Roosevelt had promised was no longer a dream, it was a blueprint for dominance. And dominance came swiftly. By 1943, America's aircraft production dwarfed that of every Axis nation combined. The United States was not merely catching up, it was leaping ahead. In a single year, American factories produced more planes than Germany had built in the entire war to that point. The scale of production defied comprehension. Fighter planes rolled off assembly lines in waves. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator filled the skies in formations that stretched from horizon to horizon. By 1944, new B-29 superfortresses were in the air, capable of flying farther, faster, and higher than anything the Luftwaffe could match. As Göring watched from Berlin, his laughter faded into disbelief. Reports poured in from the front. American bombers raining destruction on German cities and factories with relentless precision. Each month brought more squadrons, more bombers, more fighters. The Luftwaffe, once supreme, was being outnumbered, outproduced, and outflown. Göring's pilots, once confident aces, were exhausted, facing wave after wave of fresh American airmen. The Luftwaffe could shoot down 100 planes, but America would replace them with 200 more. Göring had mocked the idea of 50,000 planes. Now over his own country, the skies darkened with twice that number. The psychological impact on Germany was profound. Göring, who had once promised Hitler that not a single Allied bomb would fall on Berlin, now faced daily bombardments. The once proud Reich was burning from the skies. Ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, oil refineries in Ploiești, aircraft assembly plants in Regensburg all lay in ruins. American air raids became the daily drumbeat of German defeat. Civilians took shelter in bunkers as the sirens wailed, while Göring could offer little more than hollow reassurances and excuses. His Luftwaffe, stretched thin and crippled by shortages of fuel and pilots, could no longer defend the homeland. Every raid over Germany was a living testament to his failure. The bombers that Göring once dismissed as impossible were now unstoppable. The industrial miracle of American aviation had reshaped the war itself. Air superiority, once the domain of the Luftwaffe, now belonged to the United States and its allies. The skies over Europe were filled with the roar of American engines, the gleam of silver fuselages, and the determination of men who flew for freedom. From the English countryside, vast airfields launched missions day and night. From North Africa to Italy to France, American planes paved the way for every advance, every invasion, every victory, and behind those planes stood the power Göring had never imagined, the power of a united people. Each aircraft carried not just bombs and bullets, but the spirit of millions who had built them. The workers in Detroit, the welders in California, the riveters in Kansas. They were all part of the squadron. Every rivet driven, every engine tested, every wing polished was an act of defiance against tyranny. Göring had believed that democracy bred weakness. He discovered instead that democracy bred strength. For in America's free factories, creativity thrived, innovation flourished, and the will to win burned brighter than in any dictatorship. The diversity of American aircraft reflected that innovation. There were the agile P-51 Mustangs that hunted the Luftwaffe across the skies, the rugged P-47 Thunderbolts that tore through enemy formations, the workhorse B-17s that could take crippling damage and still bring their crews home. There were C-47 transports carrying supplies and paratroopers, and later, the mighty B-29s that extended America's reach across oceans. Each of these machines was a triumph of engineering, but more importantly a triumph of purpose. Together, they represented the physical manifestation of Roosevelt's promise, the embodiment of a nation that refused to be underestimated. As American production accelerated, the Luftwaffe's decline became irreversible. Göring's factories, already strained by Allied bombings, could not keep pace. Skilled labor was conscripted for the front lines. Aluminum fuel and spare parts grew scarce. Pilots were rushed through training, sent into battle with little experience, while American pilots grew stronger with each mission. Göring's once proud Air Force was dying in the very skies it had once ruled. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe could no longer mount effective resistance. American bombers roamed almost freely, striking at will. The laughter that had once echoed in Göring's halls was now replaced by silence and despair. Even Hitler began to lose faith in his once vaunted air marshal. The man who had promised air supremacy could now only deliver excuses. He blamed the weather, he blamed his subordinates, he blamed Hitler's interference, but deep down Göring knew the truth. He had underestimated a people who did not know the meaning of surrender. He had misjudged a nation that could turn its peacetime prosperity into wartime might. He had laughed at Roosevelt's promise of 50,000 planes. And now those planes filled the sky from Normandy to Berlin. The final humiliation came as Allied air power paved the way for the D-Day invasion in 1944. Thousands of American and British aircraft swarmed over France, clearing the skies, destroying railways, bridges, and defenses. Göring's Luftwaffe, powerless to intervene, could do nothing but watch as the greatest amphibious invasion in history unfolded. The myth of Luftwaffe invincibility was shattered forever. Göring, once adorned in gold and glory, now stood surrounded by the ruins of his empire, mocked not by enemies but by his own empty boasts. When Berlin finally fell and Göring was captured, the arrogance that had once defined him was gone. He could no longer hide from the truth that had followed him from the first moment he laughed at Roosevelt's words. The truth that the laughter of one man cannot stop the determination of millions. He had believed that dictatorship and control could outmatch freedom and faith, but the skies told another story. They told of how free hands, guided by belief, could build a force so vast it blotted out the sun. By war's end, America had built over 300 Zaluzan aircraft. Göring's prediction had not merely been wrong, it had been obliterated by reality. The Luftwaffe that once terrorized Europe was gone, its legacy buried under the roar of American engines. Göring had thought numbers alone defined power, but he failed to see what those numbers meant. The will of a nation united in purpose, the genius of innovation born from liberty, and the unstoppable momentum of a people who refused to be intimidated. In the end, Göring's laughter stands as one of the greatest ironies of the war. His mockery became the measure of his own downfall. The sound that once echoed in German halls of power was drowned beneath the thunder of 100 Zaluzan American planes, soaring not only as weapons of war, but as symbols of human resilience. For when freedom is challenged, when democracy is doubted, it answers not with fear, but with flight. When the United States entered World War II, the balance of power in the skies was uncertain. Germany's Luftwaffe had conquered Europe, Japan's Zero fighters ruled the Pacific, and Britain's Royal Air Force was still recovering from the Battle of Britain. America's air power, though growing, was still untested on a global scale, yet within a few short years, American aircraft would not only dominate the skies, they would redefine warfare itself. They would strike with a precision and reach no nation had ever achieved, and in doing so, they would turn the tide of the war from despair to victory. At the start, America's Air Force was a shadow of what it would become. In 1941, its pilots trained in obsolete planes and lacked combat experience. But America had something far greater than experience. It had vision and it had industry. Factories began working around the clock, engineers raced to improve designs, and young men lined up to learn to fly. From this whirlwind of effort came an air armada that would change history, a fleet of fighters and bombers so vast and powerful that it could strike anywhere, anytime on any front. The transformation began with one aircraft, the B-17 Flying Fortress. When it first took to the skies, few could have predicted the role it would play in breaking the back of Nazi Germany. It was a massive, four-engine bomber that could fly high, carry a heavy load, and take incredible punishment. Crews often told stories of limping home with half a wing gone or engines burning. The aircraft riddled with holes yet still holding together. The B-17 symbolized more than power. It represented endurance, the spirit of a nation that refused to be broken. In the dark days of 1942 and 1943, when Britain was still under siege and Europe was enslaved, the flying fortresses crossed the English Channel in long, glittering formations, heading toward the heart of the Reich. Each mission was a brutal gamble, flak exploding around them, German fighters swarming from every direction. The losses were terrible. Planes went down in flames over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen. But they kept coming. Day after day, week after week, the skies over Europe filled with American bombers, and slowly the Luftwaffe began to break under the relentless pressure. Behind them came the B-24 Liberator, faster, longer, ranged, and more numerous. Its vast production at Ford's Willow Run plant turned aviation into an industrial miracle. These bombers could reach deep into enemy territory, striking oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, and transportation networks. The combined bombing power of the B-17 and B-24 was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Factories that fueled the German war machine were reduced to rubble, railways crippled, fuel supplies dwindled. By 1944, the once invincible Luftwaffe was fighting for survival in its own skies. But it wasn't just the bombers that changed the war, it was the fighters that flew with them. For years, Allied bombers suffered heavy losses because they lacked long-range escort fighters. WWII had mocked the idea that anyone could protect bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But then came the P-51 Mustang. Sleek, fast, and deadly, it was the aircraft that shattered German air superiority once and for all. With its new Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang could fly at high altitude for hours, escorting bombers deep into Germany. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe's hunters became the hunted. The P-51 pilots, many in their early 20s, took to the skies with fearless determination. They painted names and symbols on their planes. Old Crow, Big Beautiful Dole, Glamorous Glen, and soared into battle with a mix of skill and audacity. They hunted Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs with precision, engaging in dogfights that blazed across the clouds. The air over Europe became a deadly chessboard, and the Americans learned to dominate it. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was no longer a threat. The skies belonged to the Allies. WWII's once proud pilots could only watch helplessly as Allied bombers roamed unchecked, burning through the German industrial heartland. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, another kind of war was being fought, one of islands, oceans, and distance. Japan's Air Force had begun the war with some of the finest pilots and aircraft in the world. The Mitsubishi Zero was a marvel of maneuverability, unmatched in the early years of the conflict. American pilots, flying slower, less agile planes like the P-40 Warhawk, struggled to match Japan's early dominance. But as in Europe, America adapted. New aircraft designs arrived, planes that could outclimb, outfight, and outlast their enemies. The F-SIF Hellcat became the scourge of the Japanese Navy. Built quickly and in vast numbers, it was the perfect blend of power, durability, and simplicity. In the hands of US Navy pilots, it swept Japanese fighters from the skies in battle after battle. From the Philippine Sea to late Gulf, the Hellcat proved unstoppable. At the same time, the F-4U Corsair, its distinctive gull wings cutting through the air, dominated from island airstrips and carrier decks alike. Together, these aircraft turned the tide of the air war in the Pacific. As America advanced from island to island, another aircraft emerged as the unsung hero of the skies, the C-47 Skytrain. Known affectionately as the Goonie Bird, it was the lifeline of the Allied advance. It carried paratroopers into battle, dropped supplies to soldiers fighting in remote jungles, and evacuated the wounded. In Europe, C-47s filled the skies over Normandy on D-Day, dropping the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions behind enemy lines in the dead of night. In Burma and the Philippines, they flew through monsoon storms to deliver food and ammunition to ground troops. Wherever there was need, the C-47 was there, proving that victory depended not only on destruction but on delivery. By 1944, the true power of American air superiority became clear. Air power was no longer just support, it was strategy. Bombers shattered the enemy's capacity to fight. Fighters cleared the skies for invasions. Transport aircraft sustained entire armies across continents. The air war had become the deciding factor in ground and naval campaigns alike. The invasion of Normandy was possible only because Allied aircraft had destroyed Germany's transportation networks, cutting off reinforcements and supplies. In the Pacific, the leap from island to island was guided by reconnaissance planes and protected by carrier-based fighters that dominated the seas from above. Then came the aircraft that would bring the war to its final, devastating conclusion, the B-29 Superfortress. The most advanced bomber ever built, it was a flying fortress of unprecedented range, speed, and payload. Its pressurized cabin allowed it to fly above enemy flak, and its remote-controlled gun turrets made it a marvel of technology. The B-29's arrival marked a new era of warfare, one where no distance was too great, no city beyond reach. Operating from newly captured islands like Saipan and Tinian, the B-29s launched massive raids on Japan, reducing industrial centers to ash. It was in one of these aircraft, the Enola Gay, that the war found its most terrible and decisive moment. When the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, followed days later by another on Nagasaki, the skies delivered the final blow that ended the war. Those missions, carried out by American airmen who had spent years training in secrecy, demonstrated the ultimate reach of air power. It was not only a weapon of destruction, it was the embodiment of technological and industrial supremacy. The aircraft that had once been laughed at by Ju Ring now stood as instruments that reshaped the world order. What made America's air dominance so transformative was not just the machines themselves, but the system behind them, the synergy of engineering, logistics, and willpower. The United States built not only aircraft but the infrastructure to sustain them, training schools, maintenance depots, supply chains, and fuel networks that stretched across the globe. Airfields appeared in deserts, jungles, and remote islands. Thousands of mechanics, engineers, and ground crews worked tirelessly to keep the air fleet in motion. The scale of coordination was staggering. It was as if the entire nation had sprouted wings. The human cost was immense. Thousands of young men never came home from their missions. They flew into walls of flak, faced deadly dogfights, and perished in the cold, thin air miles above the earth. Yet their courage never faltered. They believed in something larger than themselves, the idea that freedom must rule the skies if it were to survive on the ground. Their sacrifice gave meaning to the machines they flew. For all the technological marvels of the B-17, P-51, and B-29, it was the spirit of those who flew them that gave them power. The change America's aircraft brought to the war was also psychological. For the first time, the Axis powers realized that no matter how far they ran, they could not escape the reach of Allied air power. German factories deep inland were bombed with precision. Japanese cities, once untouchable, were now vulnerable. The skies that Ju Ring once boasted belonged to him now belonged to the Stars and Stripes. This shift broke the will of the enemy and lifted the hearts of the oppressed. When people across occupied Europe looked up and saw American planes overhead, they saw not just war machines. They saw hope. By the war's end, the world had entered a new age, the age of air power. America had built nearly 300,000 aircraft, from fighters to bombers to transports, and in doing so, it had changed the very nature of warfare. No longer would battles be decided only by armies and navies. Now, control of the air would decide the fate of nations. The sound of an American engine overhead became the sound of freedom itself. From the factories of Detroit to the skies over Berlin and Tokyo, that sound carried the same message: democracy could build faster, fly farther, and fight harder than any tyranny. And so, the laughter of Herman Ju Ring, the man who had once mocked America's ambitions, was silenced by the roar of 100,000 engines. His empire crumbled beneath the very power he had dismissed. The bombers he had laughed at leveled his cities, the fighters he had scorned swept his pilots from the skies, and the spirit he had ridiculed became the force that liberated the world. The course of the war had been changed forever, not only by the might of American aircraft, but by the belief that freedom, once airborne, can never be brought down. When we talk about victory in the air, it is easy to imagine only the roar of engines and the thunder of bombs. But behind every flight that soared over Europe, every bomber that crossed the Pacific, every squadron that arrived on time to strike or supply, there was something greater and quieter: America's unmatched mastery of logistics. While others fought battles on maps, America built highways of air, sea, and steel that encircled the globe. The war was not won by courage alone, but by the invisible web of factories, ships, railways, fuel lines, and airfields that made courage possible. When Franklin Roosevelt called for 50,000 planes, the challenge was not merely to build them. It was to deliver, fuel, maintain, and deploy them across the farthest reaches of the earth. No other nation in history had attempted anything so vast. Germany had Europe. Japan had its islands, but America had the world. From the tundra of Alaska to the jungles of Burma, from North African deserts to Pacific atolls, the United States built a logistical network that dwarfed anything before it. It began with vision. American planners realized early that air power meant nothing without global reach. A bomber grounded for lack of fuel, a fighter missing a spare part, or a transport unable to land was as useless as no plane at all. So the War Department began mapping routes across oceans and continents. Engineers were dispatched to carve airstrips out of wilderness. Construction battalions laid down runways in coral sands, engineers blasted through jungle, and Seabees turned empty islands into operational airbases. To fuel this network, America built an empire of supply. Tankers carried aviation gasoline across the Atlantic and Pacific in endless convoys. Massive depots were established in Britain, Egypt, and India. Thousands of workers, soldiers, and civilians managed inventories of engines, tires, radios, and ammunition. It was not glamorous work. No medals were awarded for keeping an aircraft running, but it was essential. Every gallon of fuel, every spark plug, every bullet that reached the front line had to be planned, packed, shipped, and delivered across thousands of miles of perilous sea. The air itself became a highway. The Air Transport Command, often overlooked in the tales of heroism, built and maintained the arteries of the Allied world. Its pilots did not fight dogfights or bomb cities. They fought geography. They flew through monsoons and over mountain ranges. carrying everything from mail and medicine to engines and food. Their routes stretched from Miami to Morocco, from Cairo to Karachi, from India over the Himalayas to China. The hump, as that deadly route over the Himalayas was called, became a symbol of endurance. American pilots flew in thin air where oxygen froze in their masks and engines failed from the cold. Yet day after day they kept China supplied, ensuring that the fight against Japan continued on multiple fronts. In Europe, logistics became the silent weapon that made D-Day possible. Before a single soldier landed on the beaches of Normandy, America had already won the logistical war. Every aircraft that darkened the skies on June 6 was backed by months of careful planning. The invasion required thousands of transport planes, gliders, and bombers. They had to be fueled, armed, and ready to strike precisely on time. Behind every pilot were ground crews who had worked through the night to prepare the planes. Behind them were mechanics who had repaired engines in rain and mud. Behind them were factory workers in Detroit and Seattle who had built the parts months earlier. It was a living chain of effort that stretched from the heartland of America to the battlefields of France. The same story unfolded in the Pacific, only on a scale even more staggering. The distances were greater, the terrain harsher, and the enemy more determined. But America adapted. Aircraft carriers became floating air bases, each one a city of machines and men. On remote islands like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima, engineers landed before the soldiers to build the runways that would make victory possible. The moment the beaches were secured, bulldozers and graders began shaping the coral into airstrips. Within days, fighters and bombers would arrive, and the American advance would continue, always supported from the air. This logistical power was the beating heart of the Allied advance. The Red Ball Express in Europe kept Patton's tanks rolling, but it was air logistics that kept the bombers flying and the paratroopers supplied. Fuel and munitions were flown in by the ton, often through skies still contested by German fighters. The ability to move men and material by air gave the Allies flexibility no enemy could match. When roads were destroyed or ports bombed, the Americans simply took to the sky. Supply drops saved entire divisions surrounded in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge. The skies themselves became a lifeline. The genius of America's logistics lay in its organization. Every plane had its part, every base its function, every route its rhythm. A bomber could be built in Seattle, tested in Kansas, flown to Newfoundland, across the Atlantic to Britain, and into combat over Berlin, all within weeks. The scale defied imagination. There were over 75,000 aircraft maintenance depots, training schools, and assembly plants operating at the height of the war. Millions of people worked behind the scenes to keep the air fleet alive. While pilots were celebrated, these men and women became the silent engineers of victory. Fuel was the lifeblood of this machine. To feed it, America produced an ocean of gasoline. Synthetic rubber plants, oil refineries, and chemical factories worked around the clock. Convoys carried fuel in vast tankers escorted by destroyers, while pipeline systems spanned continents. In Britain alone, 100 million gallons of aviation fuel was stored underground in secret depots before D-Day. Each bomber sortie over Germany consumed thousands of gallons, yet the supply never faltered. The enemy bombed refineries and submarines stocked tankers, but the flow continued. America's logistical power could absorb losses and still deliver abundance. And then there were the spare parts, the endless stream of components that kept planes flying. Engines, tires, wings, propellers, radios, all standardized and interchangeable. If a bomber landed with a damaged engine in North Africa, the replacement might come from a factory in California, shipped through New York, crossed the Atlantic, and arrived by air transport in days. This efficiency came from an industrial mindset that treated aircraft not as luxury machines, but as products of mass production. The assembly line mentality that had once built cars now sustained the war. Every nut and bolt had a number, every tool a purpose. But logistics was more than material, it was strategy. America understood that to control the air, it needed to control time and space. Speed became a weapon. The ability to move resources faster than the enemy could react gave the Allies constant initiative. When Germany or Japan shifted forces, America shifted faster. When fuel ran low, America built new refineries closer to the front. When an airfield was lost, another was built within days. This adaptability was unmatched. Dictatorships thrived on central control. Democracies thrived on coordination. The decentralized, flexible nature of American logistics allowed rapid innovation. Problems were solved in real time by thousands of minds working independently toward a shared goal. At the heart of it all were the people who made it possible. The pilots of the transport planes, often overlooked, flew without glory. They braved storms, darkness, and enemy fire to deliver the parts and fuel that fighters and bombers needed. The mechanics on forward bases worked with little sleep, sometimes under attack, repairing aircraft in mud and heat. The women in factories packed crates. The engineers designed modular systems. The sailors on cargo ships faced U-boats in the Atlantic. Together, they formed a living network that turned the impossible into routine. Even the very concept of global war was redefined by this logistical mastery. Before World War II, no nation had ever waged a conflict across multiple oceans simultaneously. America not only did it with precision. Supplies moved in waves, each time to coincide with offensives thousands of miles apart. In 1944 alone, over 2 million tons of supplies were delivered by air. Troops were rotated between continents. Aircraft ferried across the world in meticulously planned stages. The planet itself became interconnected by American air roads. As the war drew to a close, the scope of what had been achieved became clear. America had built a logistical machine capable of sustaining millions of men and hundreds of thousands of aircraft on opposite sides of the globe. The German Luftwaffe, once a terror of the skies, was paralyzed not just by lack of pilots but by lack of fuel, parts and coordination. Japan, isolated and starved of resources, could no longer maintain its air fleets. In contrast, the United States ended the war with supply lines still expanding, airfields still multiplying, and factories still increasing output. The difference was not only industrial, it was philosophical. America had turned logistics into an art form, a science of freedom fueled by belief in efficiency, organization, and human ingenuity. The global reach that emerged from this logistical power did not end with the war. The roads carved by Air Transport Command became the foundations of post-war aviation. The airfields built on Pacific Islands became the stepping stones of modern travel. The wartime mastery of global supply created a world where no distance was insurmountable. But in those years of fire and struggle, it was logistics that gave wings to victory. The ability to connect continents, deliver hope, and sustain force was the quiet miracle behind the thunder of America's aircraft. And so, while WWII mocked the idea of 50,000 planes, America not only built 100,000, it built the world's first truly global air network. Each plane that flew was not just a weapon, but a node in a living web of human effort that spanned oceans and mountains. From the factories to the front lines, from the oil fields to the open sky, the United States proved that the true power of a nation lies not only in what it builds, but in how far it can carry its vision. The bombers, fighters, and transports that filled the skies were only the visible tip of an invisible colossus. The logistics of freedom, vast, relentless, and unstoppable. When the war began, Hermann Göring stood before Hitler and promised that no enemy bomb would ever fall on German soil. He boasted that his Luftwaffe would rule the skies of Europe, that his pilots were the best trained, his planes the most advanced, his air strategy invincible. The world had every reason to believe him. In 1939 and 1940, the Luftwaffe was a machine of destruction unlike anything the world had ever seen. It crushed Poland in weeks, shattered the skies over France, and terrorized London with wave after wave of bombers. Göring believed he had built a force so supreme that no power could challenge it. Yet by 1945, his proud air arm lay in ruins. Its pilots dead, its airfields bombed to dust, its fuel gone, and its legend reduced to ash. What had begun as the symbol of Nazi might ended as a ghost scattered across the skies. In the early years, the Luftwaffe's dominance seemed absolute. German air doctrine had been designed for swift, decisive war, blitzkrieg. Its aircraft were built for speed and precision, the Messerschmitt Bif 109, the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, the Heikel He 111. These planes were terrifyingly effective in short, concentrated campaigns. They struck hard, broke defenses, and moved on before the enemy could respond. But Göring's confidence was built on illusion. His air force had been engineered for lightning war, not for endurance. It lacked the depth, logistics, and industrial foundation to fight a long global conflict. When Göring laughed at Roosevelt's declaration to build 50,000 planes a year, he laughed not only at a number but at an idea. He could not comprehend how a democracy could mobilize its industry, how a free people could outproduce a dictatorship driven by fear. He believed that only a regime of discipline and obedience could achieve such vast goals. But as American factories roared to life, as British radar improved, and as Soviet resistance grew, Göring began to face the nightmare that he had mocked. The turning point came in the skies over Britain. For the first time, the Luftwaffe faced an enemy it could not break. Göring had promised Hitler that his bombers would reduce London to rubble, that the Royal Air Force would be annihilated within weeks. Instead, the Luftwaffe bled itself dry over the English Channel. British pilots fought with desperate courage, guided by a new secret weapon, radar, and supported by a home defense network that could repair, refuel, and replace aircraft faster than Germany could destroy them. Göring underestimated British resolve and overestimated his own power. When the Battle of Britain ended, the Luftwaffe had lost 700 aircraft and thousands of experienced pilots. It was the first great crack in the armor of Nazi air power. But even then, Göring refused to see the truth. He blamed the weather, the planes, even his pilots, anyone but himself. His arrogance blinded him to the storm that was gathering across the Atlantic. While Germany struggled to replace its losses, the United States was just beginning to build. In 1941, American factories were producing hundreds of planes a month. By 1943, they were producing thousands. Göring's Luftwaffe, stretched thin across Europe, North Africa, and the Eastern Front, found itself fighting not one enemy, but many, each one stronger, richer, and more determined than the last. The nightmare deepened on the Eastern Front. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Göring promised that his planes would crush the Red Air Force in days. At first it seemed true. Soviet planes burned on their runways, their pilots overwhelmed. But as the war dragged on, the Luftwaffe found itself swallowed by the vastness of Russia. Its supply lines stretched thin, its aircraft worn out by the endless demands of the front. Every victory seemed to demand twice as many losses to sustain. Soviet factories relocated deep into the Urals began churning out swarms of Yak and Il-2 aircraft. The endless steppe became a graveyard for German pilots. Meanwhile, in the West, American bombers began to appear in the skies over Europe. At first, WWII dismissed them as a nuisance. He boasted that any daylight raid would be suicide, that his fighters would tear the bombers apart. But the Americans came anyway. They came in waves of hundreds, flying in tight formations, bristling with guns, heading straight for the industrial heart of Germany. The first missions were costly. Entire bomber groups were lost. Yet every time one wave fell, another rose to take its place. WWII watched in disbelief as the bombers kept coming, unstoppable, unending. The real terror came when the P-51 Mustang arrived. The Americans had finally built a fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. With its long range and deadly agility, it hunted the Luftwaffe wherever it dared to rise. The German aces, those once proud knights of the sky, found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. Every time a German pilot fell, there were fewer replacements. Training schools were rushed, fuel was rationed, and young boys barely out of their teens were sent into battle against seasoned American veterans. The Luftwaffe that had once conquered Europe was being annihilated from within. The industrial war was one the Nazis could not win. American factories built 100,000 planes. German factories struggled to produce even a fraction of that. Every bomber that Germany lost was a blow it could barely replace. Fuel became scarce as Allied bombers pounded refineries and oil fields. By 1944, entire Luftwaffe squadrons were grounded, not because they lacked planes, but because they lacked fuel to fly them. Mechanics drained the tanks of wrecked aircraft to fill a handful that could still fight. The Luftwaffe was dying not in battle but in starvation. The bombing campaigns were relentless. The once proud cities of the Reich, Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, were turned into infernos. WWII, who had once strutted in his white uniform, bedecked with medals, could only watch helplessly as his air defenses collapsed. Each night, British bombers came in the dark, their engines humming like the sound of doom. Each day, American bombers came in daylight, escorted by fighters that blotted out the sun. Flak guns fired until their barrels melted, but it was never enough. The Reich that had promised to last 1,000 years was being consumed by fire from the sky. Inside the Luftwaffe, despair replaced confidence. Veteran pilots knew the war was lost. Yet they continued to fly because they had no choice. Many of them had begun the war as heroes hailed as the best in the world. Now, they were reduced to flying obsolete machines, their friends dying faster than they could be replaced. Training programs became rushed and desperate. New pilots were sent into combat after only a few hours in the air. The average life expectancy of a Luftwaffe fighter pilot by 1944 was just weeks. The arrogance that had once fueled the German Air Force was gone, replaced by exhaustion and fatalism. WWII himself became a caricature of his former self. Once flamboyant and confident, he now avoided Hitler's meetings, terrified of his master's rage. Each failure brought new humiliation. Hitler accused him of cowardice, of betrayal, of incompetence. The man who had promised to defend Germany's skies was now powerless. His airfields were rubble, his pilots dead, his planes grounded. He tried to launch new miracle weapons. The jet-powered Me-262 and the V-2 rocket, but it was too late. The Me-262, though revolutionary, came too few and too late. Its pilots were inexperienced, its fuel supply crippled, its bases bombed before it could make an impact. By 1945, the Luftwaffe existed in name only. The once mighty air force that had dominated Europe in 1940 was now scattered remnants, fragments of squadrons hiding in forests, trying to protect what little was left of the Reich. American and British bombers roamed freely over Germany, attacking by day and night without resistance. Even training fields and small villages were struck, for there was no longer a safe place to hide. German civilians could look up and see the black silhouettes of Allied aircraft, crossing the sky in endless procession. The air that had once belonged to WWII now belonged to his enemies. And yet, in its collapse, the Luftwaffe became a tragic symbol of the entire Nazi dream. Brilliant in its conception, monstrous in its ambition, and doomed by its arrogance. WWII had built his air force on pride and power, but not on sustainability. He had believed that fear could drive men harder than freedom, that tyranny could outproduce democracy. He had believed that industry served the dictator's will, not the people's purpose. But America had proven him wrong. While German workers toiled under the lash of war, American workers labored under the banner of liberty. While German engineers obeyed orders, American engineers innovated. While German pilots fought for survival, American pilots fought for victory. The Luftwaffe had been crushed not just by superior numbers, but by superior spirit. By the time Berlin fell, WWII was a broken man. His headquarters were bombed, his airfields gone, his authority in ruins. The Luftwaffe that had once terrified nations could no longer defend its own capital. As Soviet troops closed in, he fled, stripped of command, stripped of dignity. The man who had once laughed at America's impossible dreams of production was now a prisoner, forced to witness the consequences of his own arrogance. His laughter had echoed across Europe in 1940. By 1945, it had been replaced by silence. When the war ended, historians would look back and see the collapse of the Luftwaffe as one of the most complete and dramatic reversals in military history. A force that had begun the war as an unstoppable juggernaut ended it as a wreck. Its planes littered airfields like broken wings, its factories reduced to ashes, its leader condemned. And at the heart of that collapse was the very thing WWII had mocked: the industrial, technological, and moral power of the United States. America had not only built more planes, it had built the future. The Luftwaffe's fall was more than a military defeat, it was the end of an illusion. It proved that no matter how terrifying a dictatorship may seem, it cannot sustain the fires of war against a free nation united in purpose. Ring had believed that willpower could replace resources, that intimidation could substitute for innovation. He learned too late that true strength comes not from arrogance but from endurance. And as the wreckage of his air force smoldered across Germany, the sky itself bore witness to the truth. He refused to believe the freedom he scorned had conquered the air, and through the air it had conquered tyranny. The great paradox of the Second World War was that while Germany prided itself on its rigid discipline, centralized control, and strict efficiency, it was ultimately the flexible, open, and innovative democratic system of the United States that outproduced and outperformed it. When Hermann Göring laughed at Roosevelt's goal of producing 50,000 planes a year, he was not just mocking the number, he was mocking the very idea that a free people could organize themselves on a massive industrial scale. He believed that only a totalitarian state, with command from the top and obedience from the bottom, could marshal such power. What Göring failed to grasp was that America's strength did not come from coercion, it came from conviction. It came from the belief that ordinary men and women, given the tools, the trust, and the freedom to innovate, could achieve extraordinary things. The power of free industry, guided by democratic ideals, proved to be not only morally superior but also materially unstoppable. Unlike the Nazi war economy, where every decision flowed downward from a dictator and his ministers, America's wartime mobilization drew from thousands of independent minds and hands. Industrialists, engineers, factory workers, union leaders, and even small-town mechanics had a voice in shaping how production would happen. The War Production Board didn't command factories by decree, it partnered with them. The government set broad goals, but the methods and innovations came from the people who knew how to make things work. This allowed for a speed of adaptation that no dictatorship could match. When bottlenecks appeared, American engineers found creative workarounds. When materials ran short, industries invented substitutes. When one plant was bombed or delayed, another took up the slack. It was an ecosystem of ingenuity, powered by millions who were motivated not by fear but by purpose. In Germany, industrialists like Albert Speer tried to keep pace by imposing strict control over production. They centralized everything, regimented every step, and punished deviation. But this very rigidity became a fatal flaw. Innovation slowed, flexibility disappeared, and factories became vulnerable to disruption. Slave labor, drawn from concentration camps and occupied countries, replaced the skilled craftsmen who had once been Germany's pride. The result was production without passion, output without ownership. The forced laborers did not care if the machines broke down or if the parts were misaligned. They had no stake in the outcome. In America, by contrast, every rivet driven into an airplane wing carried a sense of ownership. The workers knew why they were building and for whom. They knew that each plane might be carrying their sons, brothers, or neighbors into battle. That emotional connection gave meaning to the machinery, and that meaning translated into results. The assembly lines of the United States became symbols of democratic energy. Ford's Willow Run plant, for example, didn't just produce bombers, it produced them faster than anyone had believed possible. When it first opened, skeptics doubted that complex aircraft could ever be made like cars. But through the ingenuity of American engineers and workers, Willow Run reached a point where a B-24 Liberator rolled off the line every hour. Each one was a testament to what human cooperation, rather than compulsion, could achieve. Across the nation, other plants mirrored that success. Boeing in Seattle, Douglas in California, Grumman in New York. Private companies competed not to please a dictator, but to outdo each other in patriotism and productivity. Competition, harnessed for a collective cause, became a weapon of war in itself. The American labor force was equally transformed by democratic ideals. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers, inspired by Rosie the Riveter, and driven by both necessity and pride. African Americans, though still facing segregation and discrimination, found new opportunities in defense industries and contributed their labor and skill to the war effort. Immigrants and first-generation Americans worked side by side, often building weapons that would help liberate their ancestral homelands from tyranny. It was a melting pot of effort, a living embodiment of the very diversity that dictators despised. While Nazi Germany sought purity through exclusion, America found strength through inclusion. Every hand was needed and every contribution mattered. At the heart of this democratic industry was the freedom to innovate. Engineers and designers were encouraged to experiment, to take risks, to fail and try again. The development of the P-51 Mustang, for instance, was a product of open collaboration between American and British engineers. The decision to equip it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a suggestion made outside official channels, turned it from a good plane into one of the best fighters of the war. No central planner in Berlin could have replicated that process because in Nazi Germany, deviation from the plan was seen as defiance. In America, deviation was often the source of success. Even the management of resources reflected democratic principles. Instead of hoarding or favoritism, materials were allocated through negotiation and persuasion. Civilian companies converted voluntarily, motivated by patriotism and pride in contribution. When rubber became scarce after Japanese conquests in the Pacific, Americans launched a national drive to collect scrap rubber, and scientists rapidly developed synthetic substitutes. This sense of voluntary mobilization, millions of people changing their daily lives to support the common good, was something no authoritarian regime could replicate. WWII's Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, became the victim of its own system. Its factories were scattered, its labor enslaved, and its innovation throttled by bureaucracy. By 1944, despite frantic efforts, German aircraft production could not keep pace with Allied output. The Allies built not only more planes but better ones. America's industrial base was decentralized yet coordinated, competitive yet cooperative. The strength of free industry lay in its paradoxes: independence within unity, competition within cooperation, freedom within responsibility. The results were staggering. By the end of the war, America had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 6 times what Roosevelt had originally proposed. Goering's latter had long since turned to despair. The skies over Europe, once dominated by the Luftwaffe, were filled with American bombers and fighters. The overwhelming tide of aircraft symbolized more than industrial superiority. It represented the triumph of a political philosophy. It showed that democracy was not soft, slow, or inefficient as its enemies had claimed. When challenged, it could become the most dynamic force on Earth. The contrast between the two systems became painfully clear as the war dragged on. In Germany, fear ruled. Workers labored because they had to. Mistakes were punished, dissent was silenced, and initiative was crushed. In America, workers labored because they wanted to. Mistakes were lessons, dissent was discussion, and initiative was rewarded. That difference, invisible on paper but powerful in practice, became the dividing line between stagnation and progress. Each factory floor was a small democracy in action, a place where supervisors listened, workers suggested, and improvements flowed upward as well as downward. The efficiency that grew from that cooperation outpaced anything the rigid Nazi structure could produce. Even after the war, many historians and economists marveled at how a free market system could transform so rapidly into a war economy without losing its core values. The secret lay not in compulsion, but in confidence in the idea that people, when trusted with responsibility, will rise to meet it. America's wartime production was not commanded by fear, it was led by belief. And that belief became a weapon more powerful than any bomb or bullet. The power of free industry over dictatorial control was not just a wartime advantage, it was a moral victory. It proved that efficiency does not require tyranny, and that unity does not require conformity. WWII's laughter had been the laughter of arrogance, of a man who thought freedom was weakness. But the thunder of American aircraft engines over Berlin would prove otherwise. Those engines were the voice of free people at work, the roar of democracy, built on sweat, trust, and the unbreakable will to be free. The story of how the United States achieved the greatest industrial mobilization in human history is not just a tale of machines, factories, and numbers. It is the story of the American spirit itself. When Herman Goering laughed at the announcement that the United States would build 50,000 airplanes in a single year, he mocked not just a production goal, but an entire way of life. He saw democracy as weak, inefficient, and disorganized compared to the rigid order of the Third Reich. Yet within a few short years, that same democracy turned into a thunderous engine of creation, building over 100,000 aircraft and countless other weapons that ensured victory for the Allies. The legacy of that effort went beyond the war. It demonstrated that when free people are united by conviction, when industry serves ideals rather than tyranny, and when innovation thrives under liberty, no force on earth can stand against them. The legacy of America's wartime mobilization lies in the demonstration of what a democratic society can achieve when it believes in itself. The factories that churned out aircraft, tanks, and ships were monuments not to steel and rivets but to faith in freedom, in cooperation, and in the capacity of ordinary citizens to do extraordinary things. When Roosevelt called for 50,000 planes, he was not issuing a decree from a throne, he was issuing a challenge to a people, and they answered it, not through obedience but through participation. The men and women who stepped in the assembly lines, laboratories, and drafting rooms knew that they were part of something larger than themselves. Their collective effort was not driven by compulsion, but by conscience. This collective determination became the core of the American identity during and after the war. The idea that a free nation could unite with such power and precision stunned the world. It inspired confidence not only among Americans but among their allies and future generations who looked to the United States as proof that democracy was not merely a political system. It was a force of nature. It showed that liberty, far from being a luxury, could be the foundation of resilience and progress. Where dictatorships demanded obedience through fear, democracy inspired dedication through purpose. The production miracle of the United States was the living embodiment of this principle. The lessons learned in those war years echoed long after the guns fell silent. The same factories that had built bombers and tanks turned their tools back to civilian use, ushering in an era of prosperity unmatched in world history. America's highways, suburban homes, and booming industries were built upon the foundations laid during the war. The workers who had learned precision, teamwork, and innovation during wartime applied those lessons to peacetime production. The spirit of "we can do it" did not end with VE Day or VJ Day. It became a permanent feature of the American psyche. It defined the optimism of the post-war generation, the rise of new technologies, and the country's leadership in the global economy. This legacy also reshaped global perceptions of what democratic power could achieve. Before the war, many nations believed that only authoritarian regimes could mobilize efficiently. They saw democracy as slow and divided. But America's performance between 1941 and 1945 turned that assumption upside down. It proved that strength could come from debate, diversity, and free exchange of ideas. It showed that creativity and productivity flourished not under command, but under freedom. When the smoke cleared over Europe and the Pacific, the world saw that the arsenal of democracy had defeated the machinery of dictatorship, not by imitating it, but by surpassing it through openness and collaboration. The triumph also had a moral dimension. Every plane that rolled off the assembly line, every ship that slid into the sea, and every weapon that reached the front was a symbol of a larger victory. The victory of human dignity over dehumanization. The Nazi war machine was fueled by conquest, enslavement, and exploitation. Its factories were powered by forced laborers who worked in misery and fear. The American war machine, in contrast, was powered by volunteers, by people who chose to serve, to sacrifice, and to build. That moral contrast was not lost on the world. It became one of the reasons why, after the war, America was not merely victorious but respected. The same factories that had built weapons of war soon built vehicles of recovery. Machines that helped rebuild Europe under the Marshall Plan, ships that carried aid instead of arms, and airplanes that connected nations rather than destroying them. Hermann Göring's laughter thus became the symbol of a fatal miscalculation. He had measured power only in terms of control, not in terms of conviction. He did not understand that freedom itself can be the greatest motivator. The American industrial miracle was not imposed, it was inspired. It arose not from fear of punishment, but from faith in possibility. It was the product of a nation that believed deeply in itself, and that belief became contagious. It spread through every factory, every shipyard, every airfield, and every office. It was a symphony of effort, conducted not by a dictator's whip, but by a shared sense of destiny. The legacy of this achievement was also technological. The innovations that emerged from wartime industry reshaped the future. The precision manufacturing techniques developed to build aircraft laid the foundation for the aerospace industry, which would carry humanity into space within a generation. Wartime research in materials science, radar, and engines fueled the birth of the jet age, the computer revolution, and the atomic era. The engineers and scientists who honed their skills during the war became the pioneers of post-war progress. America's industrial mobilization had not only won the war, it had accelerated the future. At the same time, the war effort redefined the relationship between government, industry, and the people. The partnership that Roosevelt's administration forged with private enterprise became a model for future collaboration. It showed that democratic government could coordinate national efforts without stifling private initiative. It demonstrated that capitalism and collective purpose could coexist, that markets could serve morality when guided by the common good. That lesson continued to shape American policy for decades. From infrastructure projects to space exploration, the balance between freedom and coordination, between individual ambition and collective responsibility, became a cornerstone of the American model of progress. But perhaps the deepest legacy of all was emotional and psychological. The generation that built those 100,000 planes, the so-called greatest generation, emerged from the war with an unshakable belief in what unity could achieve. They had seen firsthand that when Americans put aside differences, when they worked not for themselves but for the nation, miracles were possible. This belief carried over into every corner of post-war life, from community building to civil rights movements, from scientific exploration to cultural innovation. The same hands that had built bombers would later build schools, highways, and hospitals. The same imagination that had conquered production challenges would later conquer space and disease. The victory of 1945 was therefore more than a military triumph. It was a reaffirmation of the democratic experiment itself. When the first American bombs fell on Nazi industrial centers, they were not just destroying war factories. They were answering a question: could a free people be strong enough to defend their freedom? The answer, written in the skies by squadrons of B-17s, B-24s, and P-51s, was a resounding yes. The laughter of men like Göring had turned to silence, drowned out by the roar of engines built by free hands. In the end, America's industrial miracle became one of the greatest proofs of its ideals. It showed that power need not come from oppression, that unity need not come from uniformity, and that greatness can arise from goodness. The factories of Detroit and Seattle were temples of democracy as much as the Capitol in Washington. Every worker who tightened a bolt, every engineer who improved a design, every pilot who took flight, all were participants in a living testament to the power of a free nation united in purpose. The legacy of that achievement continues to shape the world. It reminds future generations that democracy is not weak, nor is it passive. It is capable of endurance, innovation, and courage that no dictatorship can match. The laughter that once echoed in Göring's chambers was the laughter of ignorance, a man blind to the strength that lies in freedom. And when the skies filled with the thunder of American planes, it was not merely the sound of engines. It was the sound of a principle proving itself to the world. It was the sound of a people who had turned belief into action, laughter into silence, and freedom into victory.